Welcome back to another episode of our month-long Women in STEM series in honor of Women's History Month. I'm Belen Concho, an ant geneticist and science communicator. Along with this interview series for the entire month of March, we are raising money for Girls Who Code. Together, we can help close the gender gap in technology fields. Please find the donation link in the show notes. Today's guest is Helen Anderson, a scientific content liaison at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. She has a Bachelor of Science in Cell and Molecular Biology and a Master of Science in Genetic Counseling. We talked to her about her schooling, qualitative versus quantitative data and measuring them, research she did in gendered and non gendered language in healthcare settings, what a genetic counselor does, and we take journeys down all sorts of other rabbit holes. Thank you so much for joining us for our month
Course.
of our Women in STEM month. Would you mind
Yeah.
giving an introduction to the colony?
Yes. Hello. Mine like an introduction of myself to the colony.
Yes,
Okay, I
please.
thought that made sense. Okay, perfect. My name's Helen. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm very excited with this Fem in STEM month. Very thrilling. I grew up in Washington State, where I am currently residing in Seattle specifically. And growing up, I was like, books are cool, animals are cool, science is fun, and found my way to studying cell molecular biology in undergrad. And I thought that was cool. So then when I graduated, I was very lucky and I got an internship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, studying cancer cells at like a mastology center. So it was like part clinical care, part research. I did that for a few months. And then when that internship was over, I took a job in biotech studying cardiomyocytes or heart muscle cells back home in Washington. I did that for a few years. And I was like, this is cool. But I was also volunteering a lot. And I was like, it would be sick if my 9 to 5 working in the lab doing genetic research and my sort of 5 to 9, all my like human oriented volunteer work, I worked at like a crisis line and a food bank and things like that. It'd be cool if they could be the same thing. So I learned about genetic counseling, which is a really cool profession, and I went to the East Coast to study that for a few years. And then my sister was like, "If you don't move home, we're gonna have a problem." And I hate problems, and so I was like, "I can move home." So I was very lucky, got my job at Fred Hutch, and I now work as a scientific content liaison, which no one knows what that means. I didn't, but basically, I just get to learn about science and then talk to people about it. So that is me. Outside of work, I like soup and hikes and my couch Clifford, who's named that because he's red. He's from IKEA.
And questioning what soup is, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Questioning what soup is. It's important to stay ever curious. Yeah.
Especially about the soups.
hmm Yeah. Never just assume something's a soup and never just assume something isn't a soup, you know? Yeah.
For a question from the chat is, what is the best soup and why is it French onion?
So what is the best soup and why is it French onion? It is French onion because them sweet caramelized onions. Ooh, and it's a soup that feels fancy but is easy. It's just time consuming, but it's not like hard. And it's very easy to make vegetarian. You just sub veggie broth. So it ain't no thing. Yeah.
And in a bread bowl? Oh,
In a bread bowl, anything in a bread bowl. Anything. And then when the bread is just like the perfect amount of like a little bit soggy, but like the crust is because you gotta eat the whole thing,
oh yeah,
you
yeah, you
know?
really have to.
You really got like my brother was like, I don't think we have to eat the whole thing. And I was like, you do, you kind of have to suffer through the end, but you do have to eat the whole thing.
You really, it's so good. Yeah, exactly. Just a little bit has seeped through, and it's just
Exactly. Yeah. Has Munchkin eaten a bread bowl yet? Is she at bread bowl age?
she is not yet, but she is at. So we had a brunch today, and
Fun.
Lita was having like some like an omelet with some bread, and she was having a
Great.
pancake, and she starts like pointing at something, and she's like really aggressively asking for this thing, and we're like, "Punch, like, what do you want?" Like, there's like the egg, and it's like, no, she wanted the toast. So I think
Oh,
she'd be
wow.
very wanting of the bread bowl, but no, we're still on just like working
Yeah.
spoons.
Yeah, that makes it. You got to walk before you can run. You got to spoon before you can bread bowl. Yeah, this all checks out.
So uh I think what our plan was tonight was right to talk some female science as well, in addition
Oh,
to your background. If you would you mind, Helen,
yeah.
if we delved into a little bit more into your background?
Please, of course. Yes, I'm here for whatever's fun for y'all.
So how did you so you were interested in the sciences because you were looking to see like how things worked, right? And how the world worked around you.
Yeah, I mean, because I believe that honesty is one of the most important qualities in talking about our career paths, I was always interested in science. I liked science a lot, but honestly, like I loved English. I loved a lot of subjects. I was sort of generally curious. I read like voraciously. I think the way that most of us do, when you're like reading in the back seat, and then like you can like wait for the street light so you can like keep reading. And so I didn't always know I wanted to study science because I liked so many things. But I had a really great science teacher in middle school, uh, Liz Corlett, shout out. And she taught at my middle school, and she just made science so engaging. And so that's when I was like, okay, I really like science. And then in high school, I took AP biology. And one day my teacher was like, all right, you already finished your AP exams. We're just going to watch Gattaca. And Gattaca, genuinely, you guys, have you seen Gattaca?
We had a watch party with the community, yeah.
Yeah. So y'all know what's up. I was like, all right, genetics is sick. I could do this. And then I always kind of thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. So like in the back of my mind, I was like, all these subjects are cool. But growing up, I just loved animals so much that I like latched onto the idea of being a veterinarian. And I was like, that's what I'll do. And I mean, even through college, I like volunteered at the animal shelter, worked at Petco, shadowed vets all the time. I was like, this is like my pre-vet life course. And then when I got to college and I started taking genetics classes, I was like, oh shoot, like I want to do genetics. Like I want to be up in there. And so then I went to research because that felt like what you do with science. I was like, people do research. But as you guys might gather from my general personality, 70-hour work weeks with no human interaction weren't my long-term vibe.
So
Yeah.
when
Did that answer
going
your
in,
question?
oh yeah, definitely. And actually,
Okay.
just to take you on the Gattaca route, I had not watched the trailer beforehand, and we were doing a
Oh yeah.
Discord watch party, and I thought it was actually the movie with John Travolta called like where they were like bombing people, and there was like a big interstellar invasion. So I was waiting for the fight scene, and John Travolta never showed up. With it's like Battlefield Earth, I think, is the movie. I got it confused
Okay.
with Gattaca, and it was very, very, very surprising when it was not the case.
Wow.
So
Yeah. No.
no, it's not that.
No,
So
not the
at the
case.
end of the at end of Gattaca, where the guy's looking up at the spaceship, I thought it was just the start of the movie, really, because then it was gonna go into like the space battles, and then it was just the end. What a disappointing movie this was.
Honestly, going into movies like blind is really fun. Going into movies with chaotically different expectations, probably disorienting because you're like, I don't understand why there's no fight scene. Like, I don't like what is all this like angst about like his identity? Like, what's happening?
It's and the building up of where's John
Yeah.
Travolta. I was like, it can't, like, this is a really long movie, isn't it? I was like, whew. Um,
have you have you ever seen this feels like a movie that like the colony might have seen. It's like one of those like small nerd cult classic things, but it's called Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog.
mm-mm.
Okay, I'd never heard of or seen it. Yeah, Gattaca is also my introduction to Jude Law, and it worked. It was a great introduction. Hello, Jude. Okay, yes. So people have seen the movie. Okay, because the movie it's like a 3-part like it's like 3 episodes, but all smushed together in like one 42-minute movie. You can find it like on YouTube. Yeah, okay, people have seen it. I've never seen it. I'd never heard of it. It's super fun. It's Nathan Fillion and Neil Patrick Harris as the leads. But like when they were super young, and it's like very campy and low budget. And like the first episode, you're like, whatever, okay, it's cool, I'm in. And the second episode, you're like, all right, this is fun and whimsical, whatever. And then third episode, suddenly you're like, this is a masterpiece. Like, dang. And it's like, anyways, I don't want to spoil anything, but you should check it out. If you got 42 minutes and you're bored, it's on YouTube. Yeah, Nathan Fillion. I was like, all right, let's go.
That's actually a really bang up cast as well.
It's a bang up cast. And then the female lead I hadn't heard of, but I think she's also like very successful, like Felicia Day or something.
Mhm.
But yeah, it was crazy. Neil Patrick Harris was great. Yeah. He's like a bad guy with a crush on a girl from the laundromat. And then it's just 3 episodes of that.
See,
Felicia Day, amazing.
it's
Thank
a
you.
good expectation versus me expecting John Travolta blowing stuff up in Gattaca.
Yeah. Very different. Yeah. Agreed.
So I think one common theme that we've seen in some of these past discussions is the importance of a good
Yeah.
teacher. And so it seems
Yeah.
like for you, it really harkens back to having those professors that really encouraged you were looking to the sciences. What was it
Yeah.
about them, like if looking back on it, that really got like a methodology that they used that got you excited and wanting to stay in the sciences?
I think for me, it was a lot of I think, like, when I think about the best teachers, they're teachers that did a lot of, like, showing, not telling. So, it was a lot of it was a lot of just, like I mean, I think the kind of teaching they do is harder because it's really effortful. But like I remember when we were learning about fossils, for example, she and her partner made these like giant sandboxes essentially and put one in each lab station. And then you went digging and you like found fossils and you like it was so tactile and everyone had a different biome and you try and figure out what biome you had based on what fossils you had. And teachers about evolution, she had everyone make like a creature and then kind of like D&D almost, she would roll a die and be like, "Okay, like there's a drought. So if your creature can handle, is drought tolerant, then you live. And if your creature isn't, then you die and don't get to procreate." And so just like the cool ways of learning where she wasn't just like evolution happens because of selective pressures. She was like, what happens if there's a selective pressure? And it's like, whoa, okay. So I think it's the openness, the engagement, and I think also the holding everyone accountable to like because she genuinely believes that all of us are smart and capable of doing science. I think removing a lot of the some of you are going to be good at this and some of you aren't mentality that some teachers have, but the idea of like all of you are going to be good at this if you apply yourselves. And that was kind of cool to like have someone when you're 12 be like, I expect you to have a work ethic. And I'm going to make it easy for you to have a work ethic. So I'm going to make you want to learn. But I think all of you are capable of this. So I'm going to make you do it in like the best, nicest, coolest way. Yeah.
That is really cool. It's almost I feel like that's the most successful way of also pulling new people into the fold of currently into science as well.
Yeah.
Like not just for kids, but also for whatever stage of life you're in. Just being like, there's not a built-in assumption, right? It's just like, hey, let's just do something
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. What have your other far, far more successful guests been saying?
Well, that's not true. And it's a very similar approach as well. Like they've
Mhm.
had educators and teachers who've made a difference. Some have also
Yeah.
had like the opposite effect where, during certain times it was very, very challenging. But it's just
That's
really
also
cool.
true.
Yeah, it's just cool to see like either in spite of or because of. Because I know a lot of people in the
Yeah.
community will be like, I used to love science, but I had that one teacher that just
Yes.
crushed it in the
Yeah.
negative way and in the positive
Yeah.
way, right? So it usually goes, I mean, it can go
Yeah.
either direction to it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just really cool to be able to see and hear about the different experiences that have framed people. So there's just not one way of doing it, essentially.
Yeah, 100%, 100%, yeah, because you're right, there are good teachers and there are bad teachers, and I think sometimes it also has to do with where you're at in life and what's gonna work for you and resonate with you, because sometimes what we think of as, like, good teachers and bad teachers can kind of be more complicated than that, like, I don't know if there was ever a class that you, like, really struggled with in school or while you were getting your PhD, but, like, for me, biochem did not come naturally. I was not one of those girlies who rolled up and was like, "Oh, yes, this makes sense." It did not make sense. I liked it, and, like, I think that was an example of a great teacher. So I went to undergrad at Western, and I'm blanking on my teacher's name, but he was lovely, so if you know the person who teaches biochem at Western, he's great. But I was like, it was a really hard class and I really struggled with it. And I got like I was also one of those freaks who was like, if you're not get if I'm not getting an A, my life has no meaning, which is not a healthy mentality. And you shouldn't, okay, you get it. Yeah. It's not healthy. We shouldn't feel that way. And yet, is that how we felt? Yes. And it was the lowest grade I ever got. I got a B minus. And I was like sobbing. I was hysterical. I was like in his office and I was like, so why am I so bad at this? And he was like, so it's a hard class. And most of you aren't going to be A level good. But as long as you're learning something, that's what matters. And he was a really great teacher because, like, I still loved the class. It was so engaging. I learned new stuff all the time. When he said structure dictates function, like blew my world. I was like, "Oh my god, you're so right." And so, I don't know. I think that's also one of those moments where like depending on where you were at in life, that could have just been a bad experience because I could have just been like, I'm getting a bad grade and I hate my life. But because of the way he taught, and maybe because I was at the point where I was ready to challenge my desire for, you know, needing to get 100% all the time. But yeah, that's kind of a non-answer. But just like sometimes it's complicated, it's a combination of good and bad, but ultimately comes out good.
No, absolutely. It's one of those I think illustrates like all walks of life are different, and so a love or dislike can be from very, very different factors coming in.
Right. It can be the subject, it can be the teacher, it can be sometimes you just like don't have enough time to dedicate to something.
So
Yeah.
you mentioned that when you were in undergrad, you were like, well, this is the route that you go down is you join a lab.
Yeah.
And so how did you decide what to join and what was the work that you were doing? I guess both as an undergrad, and then do you have to get when you're getting your master's degree and you're getting like genetic counseling? Is there a like also like
Yeah.
peel back the curtain for us on that too? Like what exactly goes into
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah. So in undergrad, I think I just like emailed some labs that seemed cool and I was hoping like needed undergrad researchers. And I ended up working at a neuroscience undergrad lab, the Rose Lab. And I wasn't there very long. Like I wasn't one of those people who like lived and breathed in the lab. I thought it was cool, but you know, I was just like one of those people who was like there occasionally doing my bit as an undergrad researcher. But we studied neuroscience and used C. elegans, which is like a tiny little worm, which I'm sure you in the colony have talked about before. And we were studying specifically like what happens in behavioral modulation if you pair a good stimuli, so like sugar water, something that a worm's going to be crazy about, and a negative stimuli, like a loud vibration or something, a loud vibration, a strong vibration. And if you pair those things together, I think they like and think they hate, sort of what happens. And can we change the pairing of these things and the timing of these things to influence the way that these animals respond, which is cool. So did that in undergrad. And then in grad school, genetic counseling is really cool because it's 2-year program and it's like 2 years consecutive. So you start and then you go all the way through summer and then you graduate and it's usually 22 months like total. And you do clinicals. And so you have your classwork, then you have your clinicals, and then you have your research. And your research could be in a lab doing like genetics research, but most folks tend to do something that's more it can be quantitative or qualitative, but tends to do something that's more clinically focused. Mine was a qualitative study, and I interviewed genetic counselors to explore the use of gendered and non-gendered language in healthcare settings, and whether that's an affirming practice, what informs those practices, how we use those practices, why we make the decisions we make regarding word choice. Because I was curious about it, because we need to serve all of our patients equally, and historically, genetics is a really gendered space, right?
Could
Because we
you
talk about
dig
X and Y chromosomes and
actually, given that it's Women's History Month, would you mind digging into that a little bit for us? Like, I guess first of all, so it's a very different field than what we've talked about, right? So like how does one
yeah.
like it is definitely interesting, but how does one even form that research question to start with? Like, what do you look at? Like,
Yeah.
there's not like necessarily past experiments, right? That you can look at and see like what you know
Yeah.
about this protein. Like that seems much more like you need to know
Right.
about history and about abstract methodologies, right? And then pulling that in and talking about like
Yeah.
developing the hypothesis. Like, could you take us through like how you even get into that work and then definitely please take us through the work as well.
Yeah, no, that's really, really great. Because you're right. It was so different than any research I'd ever done before. I was so used to doing research that was quantitative, where, you know, you're counting nuclei or you're measuring cell size or you're observing patterns of behavior. And it was very interesting to think about doing a qualitative study and to design one. And I think that's why I did it, because I wanted to give myself the opportunity to try something I hadn't tried before and something that I didn't know I would ever have the freedom to do again in an academic or professional setting. And the reason I learned about qualitative research in the first place was because a lot of genetic counselors gravitate towards qualitative research, because we love to explore sort of deep sensation, deep thought, deep feeling. And qualitative research is a great way to sort of get that really rich data, the very human data. And in my program, we actually took a class, our very first semester, you take a class called like research. And they teach you how to create a project, how to do a research question, how to pursue that. And you read papers that are similar to yours. And so you kind of learn what your study would need to look like. I created a survey in RedCap, which folks might be familiar with. It's a platform often used for qualitative research. And you learn sort of how to do like an email blast to your targeted population and how to design criteria for inclusion, exclusion. And yeah, it was just cool. And while we were learning about how to create a qualitative research project, and I was thinking about what I care about, um, I was just kind of thinking, what's something that I worry about as a clinician? Very self serving, incredibly selfish. And I'd noticed that like I was really worried about using gendered terms because I was like, I don't want to make assumptions about my patient or my patient's family. But when you're taking the family tree, you want to get a sense of like, if you're trying to figure out if a person's at an increased risk for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, you want to look at patterns of cancer in the family. And so you want to see if there's a lot of breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, sometimes pancreatic and melanoma can be related as well. So you're looking for these patterns, but sometimes these patterns can be disguised by having a family tree that doesn't have a lot of people with breasts or having a family tree that doesn't have a lot of people with prostates. And so you wouldn't necessarily see those cancers, not because this person doesn't have a genetic predisposition, but because there's been no opportunity for that predisposition to manifest. And so you're asking how many men are in the family, how many women is your partner, and you're asking about partners a lot, and you're asking about kids, how many sons, how many daughters. And so I was just like so anxious about making the wrong assumption and damaging a person in some way or damaging their faith in the healthcare system or their ability to feel connected and seen in the appointment. And so that's why I did the study. Sorry, that was long and rambling. Did that answer your question again? I'm long-winded today. Sorry. We spent
No,
all day at a research symposium on immune-related adverse events. And clearly, now I am full of words.
if we can keep it going, Helen, it's really cool because it's not something that we regularly study because we're not like that's not my
Right.
expertise. I have no idea how to create something like that. And so even the chat's
Right.
wondering like when you're making this kind of survey, like what is an example of something that you're framing and asking in something like this survey? Like you're sending it out. What was the targeted demographic and what kind of questions do you ask that will give you
Yeah.
actionable information? Because it just is so fundamentally different than right when you're looking at that nematode and you can
Right.
count the cells and it's just like you can control everything. It just
Yeah.
seems like such a hard approach to bring it to a person.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the things that you have to tolerate with qualitative research is that there are so many variables, right? And so I decided that my audience would be genetic counselors because, again, very selfish, very narcissistic. I wanted to know what people in my field were doing because I wanted to know how I should be as a care provider. And so I started with a survey, and the survey went out online through an email blast through the National Society of Genetic Counselors, so NSGC. If you're a member of the NSGC, which most folks who are practicing genetic counselors are, then you'll get this email every, once in a blue moon, and it'll say like, here are some research projects that you can participate in if you like. And so I put out a little advertisement and I was like, I'm doing a study on this topic. If you're interested, click this link, do the survey. And then the survey had questions like, oh man, I wish I had it pulled up right now, but the survey had some questions that were like the survey was mostly multiple choice. And so one question was like, how often do you use gendered language? And like, do you use it like, and then it would be like on a scale, like a Likert scale of like 0 to 10. Like, I use it a lot. I use it in most sessions. Or like, I rarely use it. I never use that. And then there was a question that was like, which of these terms do you think are gendered? Because that was interesting because that was my way of exploring sort of what do we think of as gender? Is mom a gendered term? Is dad a gendered term? Are son and daughter gendered? Are male and female gendered? And what we found is that people tended to think that boy and girl were more gendered than male and female, suggesting that colloquial terms feel more gendered to people than scientific terms, even though both typically refer to sexual organs or gender presentation. And so the survey question was a lot of questions like that and sort of gave me a way to identify which of those folks had diverse opinions, worked in very different regions, different specialties with different patients. And then I selected 10 of those folks and which with a process called purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is something you don't really do in quantitative research where you usually want like a random sample. Purposive sampling is when you're like, I'm intentionally picking these people because I think their viewpoints are going to be what I'm looking for, either because there's a lot of diversity there or because they all have expertise that I'm looking for. And then I did semi-structured interviews over Zoom with these folks. And so we chatted and I went through like, I had 10 questions. Gosh, what were my questions? I wonder if one sec. Dang it. I thought I might have a copy of it printed out somewhere because I'm actually working on typing it up to maybe potentially submit it for publication, which you don't have to do to graduate from a master's program.
Nice.
So right now it's just like at my university, but my PI is like, you should publish it. So I've been thinking about it. So anyways, so I did an interview and I was hoping to have the guide for you, but I don't. But you basically ask questions. Oh, yes.
Naive question about the interview.
Not naive at all. I'm sure it's a great question.
I bet it's naive. Do you see the person? Or is the camera intentionally off to keep it blinded?
No, this is a good question. This is a good question. Nope. You see the person. And the reason why is because you want to read pauses, facial expression, body language. That's all data in this kind of qualitative study.
Okay. So I guess even further back, Helen.
Yeah.
So when you're doing these interviews, what is data to you? That's an even more fundamental question. Like, in this science, what is data?
Yeah, no, this is so okay. I will find it I will find my write-up and I will just like share it with you. Because if you're curious. But yeah, the way that data works in qualitative studies is I use a process called latent content analysis, where my data were the words and sentences that participants use in our interview. So you have your interview, I ask them my questions. And after we've like discussed all the answers to the questions, and some of those questions were based on the survey, which I used to sort of prime them, get them thinking. And again, the purpose was to explore not just what language they use, but when and why, what resources, what motivations inform these choices. And so we talk about that for an hour. And then I re-listen to the audio and I transcribe it, including pauses, laughter, and all of those words. And then use a process called latent content analysis, where you go through and you essentially like highlight different themes that you see showing up in the transcripts, and you give them code words. And so you code each different thing. And latent content analysis refers to looking for the meaning behind the words as opposed to the literal content of what people are saying. So for example, if you'd said like, Helen, did you have a good day today? And I said, yeah, I did. That's very different than if you said, Helen, did you have a good day today? And I went, yeah, I did. You know? And so latent content analysis allows you to differentiate those two statements.
That seems like there's a lot of nuance to it.
So much nuance.
So how do you dissect away then what could be just like cultural differences as well?
Yeah.
Right? So that seems like it could be like or even like past experiences that someone has had. Like, what are some of those confounding variables?
Yeah. So one way you do that is that you have multiple people analyze the data. So I conduct the interviews, and then afterwards you also do like what they call like reflexive notes, where essentially you say like, here are ways that I could have biased this person. Here are ways that this conversation could have been different. You also are really, really open about acknowledging everything that could influence their interpretation of you. So like, I was like, I'm a femme presenting person. Other femme presenting people might be more or less comfortable with me for those reasons. Or, you know, you kind of make your theories. And then so you leave those notes to also talk about like things that came up, things you're curious about, gut reactions. And then afterward, you analyze your data, you make your code words and everything. And then you have one or more other people from your data analysis team, from your research group, also read those transcripts to make sure that they're coming to the same conclusions that you are, and you're not just assuming or projecting. And you make sure you've all come to the same sort of interpretation. And then you finish coding all the other transcripts, and you make sure you've reached what's called saturation of themes, which is when no new codes or no new themes are coming up, meaning that you sort of have reached a continuum where like the big ideas have been covered, have been captured by your sample. And then you run your themes by the research team to talk about the interpretation of them, if there are any sub-themes, if the interpretation could be wrong. And then you also run it by other folks who are less familiar with the data to see if they have any new ideas, new interpretations, or new thoughts. Yeah. Does that make sense?
What are themes and sub-themes?
Oh, great question. Yeah. So themes and sub-themes are your results, essentially. So, for example, one of the themes that emerged was that one of the parts of my question that I was asking, my guiding question, my research aims, one of those is to explore what motivates genetic counselors' word choice. Are we going for scientific accuracy? Are we going for words that feel representative of what our patient is presenting? Do we go for words that feel representative of what our patients are using themselves? Are we like doing language mirroring, creating a shared language? And one of the themes that emerged was that genetic counselors genuinely care about the way their patients feel, not just because they know that if their patient is feeling safe, is feeling seen, is feeling supported, is feeling connected to the genetic counselor, they're going to be more compliant with the appointment. They're going to share information more readily. They're going to be more likely to follow through with genetic testing. But also because also I actually don't know if having a positive experience makes you more likely to follow through with genetic testing. I don't have data on that, but one would think if you have a better experience with your care provider, you're more like that would be an assumption that I would make, but I haven't seen data on it. So, um, but what I found was that not only do you care about the patient's emotions for all these reasons, but for the most part, genetic counselors also just genuinely cared about their patient's feelings. Like genuinely just didn't like the idea that they would hurt their patient in any way, intellectually, spiritually, psychologically. And so a lot of the decision making about what words to use came down to what they think was going to make the patient feel best.
Would you say the
Yeah.
problem statement then here is how to, like, I guess, oh yeah, in your words, what is the problem statement? Like, what is the end game? Why does the regular person care about
Yeah.
this work? Like, I'm really seeing it formed
Yeah.
out, but if you could just like honestly spell it out for us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. And honestly, I think it's something that like you could struggle with like any kind of scientific research. Like why does the average person care about this? Because like we care about our work. And I think the main thing that the reason that this kind of work should exist, this sort of like sociological work, um, I think in part is just because the more we document these things, the less we have to repeat this kind of work. And the more it highlights existing problems in our healthcare system, or just encourages conversation, right? It makes us think about how we practice and what sort of standards we want to hold our field to and what we as a field think matters. And to me, when we ask questions about how does our work serve different populations, what we're asking is how do we value different populations, which I think is a much bigger question that all of us should care about.
How often do you think it's then in the ever changing landscape of the world when doing
Yeah.
this work, does it at what point do you need to repeat the survey and repeat the study, right? So it's like to ensure that you're
Right.
keeping up to date on the needs of the population because it seems like something
Yeah.
that could be very dynamic and it
Yeah.
could be also dependent on, the population that you're sampling too.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, and that's another, like, huge caveat of, like, qualitative research, the kind I did at least. I mean, there's so many caveats, but one is also you're like, "I interviewed 10 people." You're like, "These are 10 people," you know? And so I think that a lot of it has to do with in terms of what you were saying, like repetition, I think a lot of it has to do with just sort of getting a sense of what your field is demanding, what your field is calling for, and what seems to be a pressing concern in the world as a whole at that time. So there are a lot of studies that were very similar to mine that explore similar themes. You don't often with qualitative research see like an exact one for one repeat of the study, but you might see something exploring the same thing. Yeah. So like I'm seeing in the chat. Yeah. Is it a yearly survey? Seatown Raver. I don't know if it's like necessarily yearly or even 6 months. Usually not like that, especially because it's really time consuming data to collect, right? And so there's all of that. And then it's not a big sample size.
Guess too, because it's not just the survey that you send out, right? There's all these follow-up
Right.
steps that you're doing, and you're also getting the interview, and that has a lot of interpretation going into it. And then it's not just you, if I'm
Yes.
understanding correctly, right? There's others to ensure it's not just you and
Help
your
analyze the
interpretation.
data.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, that is so yeah, it's very time consuming, but can make a huge difference in a lot of people's
Correct.
lives. So it could be a very
Correct.
worthwhile thing to be pursuing.
Correct. But that's why I think it's one of the and you get this as a PhD, is that one of the challenges that you have clinicals and you have class, and then most of us are also working multiple jobs. So or at least in my case, TA and ice cream scooper, Spy Dog Ice Cream Co. Shout out. And so you're doing those things, and then you're doing your research, and then because the program's only 22 months, you're like, I need to graduate. And so you're also trying to figure out what kind of project can I conduct that feels meaningful to my field and to me as a person and feels manageable and able to be completed essentially within a single calendar year. So that puts a huge limit on your research. And that's probably why PhDs often take 7 years or a certain length of time, because one, you have to publish to the best of my knowledge. And your work is usually not limited to the scope of one calendar year.
Well, there's no a lot of places, I guess. In the UK, it's different. You have 4 years and you're out, so you have a hard out. Versus in the
Okay.
states, sometimes like there's some programs that want you published, other
You
ones that
should
don't.
have a,
But there's like no timeline. So in theory,
I feel like you should have a hard out.
you can be kept there for 10 years. There's just nothing.
Yeah.
Some really interesting questions coming into the chat, and again, I feel like it's
I
the
know. I wish
excitement
I'd
of
prepared to talk about this. I don't know why I didn't come prepared to talk about this. Sorry, everyone.
no, I mean, I think it just goes to show how exciting the topic is that, we have not talked about it before because we're not experts on it. And it's just really cool to
Right.
have someone who has the knowledge and training, who's done this work. And I think it's just the
It is
community
cool
being
work.
very excited about it. From the chat is how do you avoid bias in the interpretation of this data? For example, if all the researchers involved come up with
Yeah.
the same interpretation, is it that they're all like-minded and is that a bias? And how does one account for something like that?
Yeah. No, good with gold. 10-10 question. And a big part of that has to do with your disclosures. So typically when you think about disclosures in an academic or a scientific setting, usually your disclosures are something like, oh, I've worked with this hospital before, or I've worked with this biotech company before. They're more like financial disclosures. Disclosures in this kind of research often say, like, I'm a femme person, or I identify this way. And all of these things color my viewpoint. So, like, in my interpretation, for example, I say, like, I believe that folks should be entitled to like their identity in ways that make them feel safe and seen. And so, like, I am pro the use of like gender affirming care, for example. And so sort of talking about what your biases in that way, and that's sort of one of the ways that you avoid bias is just by acknowledging your inherent bias, because everyone has a bias. Even the most open-minded of us, I think of myself as a pretty open-minded person, even the most open-minded of us have biases. And so it's acknowledging your biases, it's acknowledging your identities, it's acknowledging where you come from. And all of that is really challenging. And it's trying to find people who have different backgrounds than you to help you interpret your data, to avoid too much homogeneity in the people reading and interpreting that data. But also, you're all working on this project together because you're all interested in it. And so you're at least connected by this shared interest. And so that's, I mean, it's tricky. I think it's a challenge with qualitative research.
Is Again, naive question. Do you end up in the paper itself disclosing what biases went into it, or is that just at like the planning and interpretation stage? And like it just
Yeah.
it's such a different world to us. And
Yeah.
how does one even like it's difficult to standardize, right? Because again,
Yeah.
like there's different people interpreting the data. And
Yeah.
so I guess how does one attempt to standardize it? And then how does one
Yeah.
attempt to make it broadly applicable, right? That also seems like it could be quite difficult to do.
Yeah, that's another huge thing you talk about is like you do talk about sort of your limitations. So you talk about like what it could and couldn't be applicable to. And this is why qualitative research I think is so interesting, but also kind of hard to wrap your mind around at first, especially when all you're familiar with is quantitative research, because it seems to break every single rule we've ever been taught in quantitative research.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really just being really open and transparent about what you're exploring, how you collected that, how you came to these themes and conclusions. And you often include like direct quotes. So you'll say, like, this is a theme that I found. And these are the quotes from the transcript that I felt led me to this interpretation. And then that also gives the audience a chance to say, like, oh, yeah, I also interpret that statement as meaning this. And it also gives them a chance to challenge you and say, I would never have thought that these quotes support that theme. So a lot of it is that. I also see a question in the chat about IRB. Yes, absolutely. You have to go through IRB for all of these because you are engaging in human data collection. And so it's human research. And so you have to go through IRB approval with your university.
So even a survey where you're not ever taking like a blood sample or something like that, there's these
Yeah.
set of ethical standards that you have to be participating in when it comes to that data. What
Yeah, 100%.
what was the training and background? Like how was that in terms of getting started with the research and creating the survey? Like How complex is that to navigate to ensure that you're respecting everyone's privacy?
It's pretty complex because it also depends on who you are as a person. And we've already established that I'm a nervous Nelly, and so I want to get an A in research, which is like not a thing. You don't get graded in so many ways, but I wanted to like do a good study and I wanted to like do a good job and I wanted to respect the time of my PI and my research team and my the I was gonna say patients, my the people who completed the survey. What is the word I'm looking for? Participants. They're participants. And so you do kind of like learn as you go. And I think that's why a lot of people who do a lot of qualitative research have more experience with it and like do a lot of follow up studies in the same sort of field, the same sort of realm. But I think for me, it was a lot of just like trial and error. And I had a really great PI. My PI was fantastic, is fantastic. He's still alive. And he's great. And so it was a lot of just like running things by him, being like, is this how you fill out IRB? Like, is this right? Is this what I'm doing? And then reading a bunch of other papers that were also qualitative data analysis to kind of figure out like how have people done this before? And at a certain point, as with all research, you just kind of start doing it and it's happening.
That is really cool to see again the background of how this works compared to the
Yeah.
quantitative, like you're comparing because you've done both, right?
Yeah.
You've done the C. elegans side of things, and then you
Yeah.
went to do the human side of things, and I'm sure it's kind
Yeah.
of just like which side
Very,
do we go into, right? Like I feel like that
yeah.
conf- I don't know, really confusion, but like that break between the two is really, really, I think, provides you
Yeah.
with an exciting perspective because it's not something that everyone might have. Like I know I don't have the side of the qualitative data. That's why we're asking all these questions. But it's just really cool
Yeah.
to have your expertise where it's on both and you can do the compare and contrast. Is there any instance where you found that the qualitative data was more in a way where it's cooler, more insightful, more exciting than
Yeah.
the quantitative side of things?
Yeah. I think that is something that I appreciate about having gotten the opportunity to do both is that it helped me appreciate different aspects of each. I think prior to actually completing qualitative research myself, I was biased towards quantitative. I was like, it's so objective, it's so pure. This is the science that we learn about in school. This is the science that we're taught of as science. So like that is what I think of as science. And so I think I was kind of like, qualitative research seems very hand wavy, you know? Like it seems like there's so many opportunities for there to be bias, for there to be a limited sample size. Like it's hard to get statistical significance. So I was like, what are we? But I think it's the fact that qualitative data is essentially giving you a way to explore why for human phenomena in a way that you cannot do with any other method. And so I think it's asking different research questions. Like I can ask, if I'm trying to figure out the way that a certain antibody is going to bind to a certain antigen. I mean, that's quantitative research all over. There's no feelings to explore there. But if I want to understand why healthcare providers behave a certain way, the best way to learn that is to ask about practices, or you can do quantitative studies where you're observing practices, where you're asking people to fill out surveys that are collecting quantitative data. You can record the number of patients they have. Like there are a lot of things you can do that are quantitative, but sometimes it's helpful to have data that is just asking why, that is exploring that introspection, that is seeking just a human explanation. And if you get enough of those human explanations, again, it gets you to something that feels like a general trend, even if it's not like we can 100% say that every single genetic counselor agrees with this feeling. You can say, well, I interviewed 10 people and all 10 of them felt this way. And it's possible that this is not representative of the whole community, but it's possible it's representative of some of the community for all of these reasons that I went through to try and make it a representative sample as best I could, given the limitations already disclosed. Again, that disclosure is huge. And then you're just like, does this resonate with anyone? And it's more of a chance for this data to open conversations than to necessarily definitively answer any one question. Does that make sense?
So what's, I guess, the actionable item like after you've
Yeah.
collected this and it looks like okay, a lot of the mindset is going on this direction. Is it more of a guidance for the genetic counselor to be more effective at maybe communicating or getting people. I guess what's the end goal? Is it to get people
Yeah.
to want to be tested, or like what's the direction that we're going in
Sure.
for it?
No, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Yeah. I think that one thing, I think that when the data is published, then that's more helpful because more people have access to your results. As it is, only my university and institution have access to those results, which feels more limiting,
Mhm.
which is probably why my PI is like, everyone should publish, please, God, please. But I think that the question isn't necessarily like, how do we achieve a certain end, but more, how do we better understand something? And so I think this was more of a way, selfishly, my takeaway from it was I was like, how do I practice as a less anxious genetic counselor? How do I be more confident in my approach to patient care? And so for me, the takeaway from having this 10 conversations and reading all the surveys and all these things is sort of like, as long as you genuinely care about the person you're talking with and you explain why you're doing what you're doing and you're willing to take feedback and the relationship is there and it's strong, then what language you're using is less important than how you're communicating with that patient overall. What you're saying to make them feel safe, how you're making sure they know that they are safe with you. Um, and so for me, the takeaway was just be more relaxed as a care provider. Be thoughtful, be intentional, always be learning, but be yourself and trust your patients to be themselves and make them feel safe to be themselves. And it's less about having a specific script or certain language that is good or bad. And yeah, I think some people, their qualitative research probably does have more definitive answers, more specific sort of things that they're saying, we should do this as a field, we should not do this as a field. But that's not the kind of research I did. And that's the other thing too about like qualitative research is I feel like sometimes people will say like you're a yeast expert or like you're a C. elegans expert. But I feel like most qualitative researchers would be like, I asked one question or like I asked some questions, but I feel like it's harder to be like an expert of anything, you know? Oh yeah, glued with gold. Yeah, psychology is psychology is a blend, quantitative and qualitative. That's actually called mixed methods when it's a bit of both. But yeah, definitely any question where they're like, how do people feel? That's qualitative research is going to give you some really rich data. Did I hear a cat?
You did. This
Stop.
is socks.
Socks, my
Tiffany looks
heart.
like she has socks on her feet. This is
My
our little
heart.
stray barn cat.
Oh my gosh. Okay, quick tangent. My brother is a hydrologist. And for those who don't know, hydrologists are water scientists. They like study water. That checks out hydrologist. And he currently does like field work. So he'll like go out to like a mining site or a drilling site or whatever, and he'll be like, we're gonna measure the water and we're gonna see what's in the water and all of that. I don't know what he does. I simply don't. And the other day he called me because he was like, Helen, like a kitten came up to me on the site. What am I supposed to do? And I was like, does it seem lost? Is it like a pet kitten or is it like a loose kitten? And he was like, I don't know. It's like cold and they're potentially predators. And he just seems like a loose little kitten. And so I was like, well, you got to get him out of there. You got to take him home with you because what if he gets hurt? There are coyotes. There are big birds. It gets cold out there. But yeah, so I was like, I do think you have to take him home. My brother was like, great. He's already on my lap. Like we're driving to the house. Like, yes, correct. And so then he got him some cat litter and some food. And then he called his wife the next day and he was like, can we have a third cat? And she was like, yeah, yeah. So now they have 3 cats. Isn't that amazing? That's my tangent.
See, Lita was like, "Oh, there's a kitten outside." I'm like, "Oh, that's cool." She's like, "We should catch it." I'm like, "No, if we leave it out there, you can have another one next year to look at." But this is why we have 6 cats in the house.
I'm
I'm not the one in charge.
obsessed.
I'm not the one in
Wait,
charge.
do you actually have 6 cats? That's amazing. Tell me all of their names, please. This is so important.
We have Noodle,
Amazing.
Hops and Barley,
Amazing.
Cannoli,
Amazing.
Socks,
Great.
and Shadow.
Okay, Shadow was the name of my cat growing up, and Cannoli is my sister's cat right now. So that is spooky.
It's hashtag
Great
guess
names.
goals. or
Yeah.
crossover goals or something. Like, uh,
I love it.
Shadow and Socks were both barn cats at Lita's mom's, and
Amazing.
Socks was caught very early on because she was sickly, and it when she was brought in the house, she immediately got into her mom's chair, which everyone's like.
Oh.
So we were like, and she like snuggles, and we're like, wait a minute, there's no way this cat has been feral forever. She knows what a couch is. She knows about TV, and it was heartbreaking because I was, it was like she just low on in pads, and so when Lita's mom couldn't take care of her anymore, Lita's like, well, what do we do? I'm like, well, whenever we go over, I always get lost for 45 minutes petting this cat, so I guess we have another one.
Oh, I
And
love
then
that.
Shadow Lita was unable to catch for the longest time, but then she got into a fight with what we think was an opossum. And
Okay.
it was a 50-50, no one really won. So Lita could catch the cat. And we
Yeah.
took her to the doctor, and the doctor was like, she has organ failure, you got 3 months. And so we'll give her a good life for 3 months. And that was 9 months ago. Um,
Amazing.
and so she's on her medicated food and she's just hangs out. And we're just like, well, all right, we got another cat. Uh,
I love that.
yeah, there's just no, there's no winning. We just keep going. But like it's
Yeah,
the beauty, right, of it, you pull in new family members, and it's just the love of being able to pull in more and more. And it's just like you want to save all of this. That's why I can't go to the pet store.
100%. Oh, yeah. No. Yeah.
I don't need to
Yeah.
see that he's been there for 3 weeks and he's
No.
had three other homes and no one I can't have that.
No, I
I
can't have
can't have
that.
that.
And especially, like, don't give me a cat with like a runny nose. That's jail. I need them. Yeah. Anytime they're like, here's the thing, he's so dumb and his whole body doesn't work. I'm like, yeah, I'll take him. Yeah, that feels right. My shadow growing up, he was diabetic for the last several years of his life. And I was like, all right, I'm going to give you sub-Q injections twice a day. Let's go, buddy. I was like in high school. I was just like a weird kid. And my dad was like, are we really getting insulin for the cat? And I was like, we are. We are.
Well, you said you were interested in veterinary medicine, right? Early
I
on.
was. I was like, this is great. I need to be able to give a sub-Q injection. No questions asked. Also, Shadow had two brain cells that never fired at the same time. So I don't think he ever noticed his injections. Like, you just pull up the scruff, you go, and then like he literally never noticed, like ever.
They never fired at the same time.
Never.
That's the quote of the night, right there.
The dumbest cat in the
Poor-
history of cats.
Poor Shadow
Loved him.
Cat.
But like, you looked in his eyes, sweet vacancy. No one's home. So sweet. It's true. Like, you've never seen a cat with like such a hollow look in his little eyes. So cute. He had horrible dandruff. Like, he was objectively a gross cat. I loved him. I got ringworm from him,
Oh God!
but I loved him. Yeah, it was
Well,
fine.
It's like your hairy son.
Shelter
You can't
cat.
not.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
speaking of who did not get ringworm,
Yes.
all right. So these patients that you're genetically counseling,
Patients.
Helen.
Yeah.
Um.
No ringworm. They could have ringworm. It's not genetic.
So, but take us honestly, just out of a curiosity question, take us back. So a genetic counselor. So you've done your work on some nematodes.
Yep.
You've done
Yep.
all this training, right, on like surveys and qualitative data and quantitative
Yep.
data. You're getting both sides of it. What does a genetic counselor do?
Good question.
Why is it important for us as regular folks
Yeah.
to chat, or when is it important to chat to a genetic counselor? And yeah, take it away.
Yeah. No, genetic counseling is a very cool profession. When asked to sort of describe it in a snapshot, I typically say that genetic counselor's job is to help people understand their own genetic information and their family's genetic information. Your genetic information being the DNA, the instructions that tell your body how to work, and use the knowledge of that information and the understanding of that information to empower you to make healthcare decisions that feel right for you and your family. Genetic counselors practice something called shared decision making, where it's really about what best serves the patient. So, what is going to help you achieve your goals? If that includes genetic testing, great. If it doesn't, that's also okay. There's no right or wrong. We don't want anything other than for you to feel healthy and to lead a healthy life. And health might look different to different people for a variety of reasons, personal and cultural. And oh, yeah, go for it.
So is that why, just to bring it back to your study, why the study that you were doing was so important, right? Because
Right.
you're not trying to get them to do X, you're trying to make them
Right.
feel comfortable to make a decision to do X or Y. And if you can't have
Exactly.
that level of comfort, if they're already put off by the language that you're using, then you aren't making the best possible care for that patient. Is that a fair
Yeah.
assessment then?
Yeah, 100%. With genetic counseling, when you talk about the way a session works, typically your patient comes in, and so you bring your patient in, and that was something that was causing me a lot of angst as a patient or as a student, was I was like, do I say Mr. Anderson or do I say Helen? Do I assume a gender or do I potentially be disrespectful by using a first name with a patient
Hmm.
who doesn't know me very well yet? So that's the first step, and that's also that like internal dialogue of like, how do I show respect in all of the ways I want to show respect? So you bring your patient into your office. Usually it's sometimes it's just you, sometimes it's you and a doctor, depending on the setting. Setting might be pediatrics, so working with kids, could be cancer, working with folks with a personal or family history of cancer, working in cardiology, so folks with a personal or a family history of heart disease, prenatal, working with pregnant folks who want to learn more about the genetics of their pregnancy, variety of different settings. And you bring the person into your office, and the first thing you do is often called rapport building. So that's just making small chat, kind of warming up your conversation between the two of you so that you feel comfortable. One of the things that I would always say is like, hey, I'm Helen, you can call me Helen. And the first thing I want to say about this appointment is that this is your appointment. If I say something that's wrong, correct me. If you want to interrupt me at any point, interrupt me. Like, you drive in this car, you know? And then you go over what's called contracting. So that's essentially me saying, like, hey, here's my plan for what we were going to cover in the session. First, we're going to take your personal history, conduct about like your personal health, the reason that you came in today, the reason you were referred. Then we're going to take a family history. So talk about your family's history of related health conditions. And the way you take a family history is typically targeted to the indication. So in a cancer setting, I'm going to ask about a family history of cancer. In a pediatric setting, I'm going to ask about different childhood conditions. And then we'll talk about genetic testing. If it's helpful, if it's indicated, what kind of testing, what the timeline would look like, what the results might look like for the different kinds of testing that we might talk about. And then we'll talk about, depending on what those results are, what might that look like for you in your life? What would that mean for your healthcare decisions? What would that mean for your family? Who else would we want to test? What sort of downstream repercussions might there be, good or bad? And then you kind of schedule your follow up. So that's typically what a session looks like. Ideally, you have an hour with a patient, but oftentimes it's less. Very rarely it can be more. And a lot of times, again, it has to depend on the indication. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is the training, so like you said, there's different reasons to go in, right? There's potentially looking
Hmm.
for a disease state, there is potentially for
Yeah.
having a kid,
Yep.
and everything everything in between.
Yeah.
You as a genetic counselor, do you train for one element of that, or are you just you spread the entire gambit?
You spread the entire gambit. Yeah. So you have to train for the whole thing. So typically, like at my program, you do 2 rotations in prenatal, 2 in what's called general, that's pediatrics and adults. So folks with any kind of suspected genetic condition. And you do 2 in cancer. So focusing on cancer specific genetics. So prenatal, cancer, and then what's called general genetics or peds. And then you also do a couple others that are more specialized. So you might do something that's specifically focusing on neurodegenerative conditions or neuromuscular conditions or cardio conditions or a variety of other specialties. Just sort of depending on your personal interests, the interests of the hospitals around you. But yeah, and then typically once folks are practicing, they specialize. It's a little bit like nursing, how all nurses have to pass the NCLEX, but then you can be a labor and delivery nurse. And the longer you do one thing, the more of a specialist you are. So even though all genetic counselors are trained to practice everything, if you've been a cancer genetic counselor for 30 years, you're probably not going to feel as comfortable doing prenatal counseling as you are genetic cancer, you know?
And presumably, there's a lot of literature to stay up to date with too, right?
There's so much literature. Yeah, you have to do like CEUs. CEUs stand for continuing education units. And healthcare providers have to maintain them, including genetic counselors. So you have to basically like record for your licensure how many classes you're taking, what classes you're taking, and you have to like do like little quizzes on some of those classes to be like, am validating that I'm attending the journal clubs, that I'm reading the literature, that I'm going to the conferences and the seminars, and providing the best, highest quality patient care, because we oftentimes when folks see genetics, they've been through the ringer. Like they are seeing genetics because like every other doctor's been like, I don't know what's up. It seems like something, but I simply don't know. And so they refer to genetics. And so we can be the difference between, a diagnosis and not ending a diagnostic odyssey. And even if we can't provide an answer or a conclusion to this journey, we can at least be a place where patients feel seen, where patients feel heard, where patients don't feel like they're crazy. Because one of the things that is frustrating and exciting about genetics is that it's always possible that there's a genetic condition out there that we just don't yet have the knowledge or the technology to diagnose. And so you kind of, yeah, yeah,
That also seems like with the patients coming in, like if they've already been through the ringer, it's all the more important for
right.
the study that you were doing, right? You're not, it's not like you're just going in for the first time to
Yeah,
the genetic counselor. It seems like you'd already be on edge for
yeah,
having to go. So
yeah,
it further validates like how important your research is. I think it's
yeah,
kind of pulling
yeah,
all together the pieces of like, wow, this is like a really not a simple kind of
right,
like appointment
right,
that you're just going to, and like all these extra
right.
factors coming into play of the importance of what you do.
Right. That because my hope is that it is simple. My hope is that it's not stressful, that you got referred and you got seen super fast and like nothing is stressful and you've never had any medical trauma. Like that is my hope. But I don't want to assume that's going to be everyone's experience. And so I just wanted to make sure that I was practicing in a way where I could serve every patient as best as possible and not just patients that had a life course or a life history that I could like immediately automatically, relate to or assume.
Helen, just to be mindful of the time, may we keep you for a little bit longer?
Yes, of course. Although I do need to plug in my laptop, but yes, of course.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure we were getting carried away with the conversation. We just
I
love having
know.
you here.
I love being here. Everyone's so nice. All right, PC is plugged in. Thank you for your
Awesome.
patience. I'm just running around today. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I'm like, oh my God, we're already past the hour mark. Like, could we please keep her for a little bit longer? Um,
I'm very long-winded.
No, we're just really excited to learn about this. And again, thank you for your time and not just today, but also coming back for another whodunit for all the work that you do with Fred Hutch. Like this is,
Ah, no, of
you feel
course.
like you're very much part of this community, and we thank you always for your time and just like sharing your expertise and experiences with us. Truly, thank you.
No, I love this community because definitely like I always feel so and this is I think probably fitting for Women in STEM month, but like I often feel imposter syndrome. You often feel like nothing you've ever done is good enough. You're never an expert on anything. And I think what I love about the colony is that it's a place where it never feels like there's that concern. Cause it's like, if you're wrong, you're wrong. Like we're all learning together. It's okay, which is really nice and like really warm. One of my coworkers today, we mentioned that we're doing these streams because we were talking about how great Jackie is, who organizes all of this because she's amazing, and so we were fangirling about Jackie. And then one of my coworkers was like, "Why do you think Twitch is so popular? Do you think it's a response to like how lonely everyone feels these days?" And I was like, "Well, that's kind of a bummer interpretation, but also kind of a beautiful interpretation because yeah, like I think it is just a way to feel connected, and I think that that's really lovely."
Yeah, you can have a community without going outside. Just,
Exactly.
you could be around people, interact with different people, and really get at those
Yeah.
connections.
And
Which
I think it can give people a way to like find their people when they might not be able to find them in their day-to-day life, but they can find them in this very targeted, special, specific way. Like what you
absolutely.
and Lita are doing is so amazing with science because you're like making science accessible. And it's not easy to find science in your day-to-day life unless you like get a job in a lab.
I mean,
So cool.
and even then, it's not straight up as simple as getting a job in the lab, right? It's
God
going
no.
through like jumping through hoops, like what have you had
Yeah.
access to? Like it is never
Yeah.
straightforward and easy. And speaking of
Yeah.
not straightforward and easy, we have a question from Neil. Um,
Ooh.
does genetic testing show a predisposition to certain ailments? But with a predisposition, do we have a handle on what environmental factors may be able to trigger it, or are there just too many variables?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really depends, right? So when we think about our genes, our DNA, the genetic instructions that tell our bodies how to work, sometimes you can look at the presence or absence of a certain gene or a certain version of that gene. Typically, we all have all the genes, But sometimes we have different versions of them that can cause different health problems. Or sometimes people are missing or have extra copies of genes that can also cause a variety of health problems. And sometimes the presence, absence, or version of a gene or a stretch of genes, stretch of DNA, can be a definitive binary yes or no answer for a certain health condition. So, for example, if you are a femme woman who has, or if you're just a person who's born with one X chromosome, typically women or people with one X chromosome have a condition called Turner syndrome. And if I do a karyotype being a kind of genetic test that allows me to look at everyone's chromosomes, and I identify that there's only one X chromosome and that's the only sex chromosome present, that is a definitive yes, this person has Turner syndrome. There are other conditions where we might do genetic testing. And, like, for example, some folks pursue genetic testing for autism. So if you have a clinical diagnosis of autism, then you can follow that up with genetic testing to see if there's something in the genes that might explain why this individual has a different neurotype. And that one's a little trickier because if we find something, maybe we see that this gene is associated with people who have autism, and we see this in folks who have ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And maybe we don't find anything, but not finding something in that case doesn't mean that this person doesn't have autism. It doesn't undo the clinical diagnosis or the identity that this person shares. But it's just sort of less definitive. And then there are some cases, like you're saying, predispositions. So that would be like cancer genetic testing, where you can test and see, does a person have a variant of this, gene, this specific subset of DNA that we think puts them at an increased risk for cancer. And if someone doesn't have the gene that we're looking for, then maybe that means that they have a general population risk because they're not at high risk. Maybe it means our technology didn't find the gene, we didn't look at the right gene, we don't have the understanding yet of what genes are associated with cancer. And even if it comes back positive and we're like, yes, this person does have this variant, we know it's associated with an increased risk for cancer, that's not a yes or no guarantee they're going to get cancer. We typically say that, for example, with like BRCA1 or BRCA2 variants, which are two genes, that certain changes in them can cause hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, or an increased risk for breast, ovarian, prostate, and then sometimes pancreatic and melanoma cancer. We typically say, like, you're at an increased risk for breast cancer. It might be up to 70 or 80% breast cancer risk, but it's still not a 100% guarantee. Does that make sense? So basically it runs the whole gamut. Like, yes, you have the condition. Yes, you're at increased risk. We don't really know, maybe. Does that make
So,
sense?
are there any actionable items? So, if you tell me, right, you have this
Yeah.
BRCA1 mutation,
Yeah.
you're going to get breast cancer like 70% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Do I get a double mammectomy to jump into that, like to prevent it? Like, or, like what is, because that seems like it could be a really serious thing, right? If I can go out in front of
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
and beat it,
Yeah.
but it's only
Totally.
70%. So, right, like at what point do you act on that as preventative care, and what point do you not?
See, this is why genetic counseling is so important. Yes, because one of the things you said, you were like, what if it's only 70%?
Hmm.
So we explore one of the questions that we'll sometimes have in sessions with patients is you'll say, so based on your genetics, you have a 72% risk of developing breast cancer. And sometimes you'll just follow with, how does that number feel to you? Because some people are like, oh, 72%, 28% chance, nothing ever happens. I feel totally safe to just write it out, see what happens. And that is super valid. Like, that is your decision to make. Other people go, 72% is simply far too high. I will not be taking those risks. I'm going to have a double mastectomy, the removal of the breast tissue, to avoid getting breast cancer, to significantly lower that risk. Because to me, the anxiety of knowing that I could have breast cancer at some point is going to be too anxiety inducing. But again, there's that other person who goes, well, I don't want to have a mastectomy. I'm really scared of surgery or afraid of complications, or I have health problems that would make that surgery really complicated, or I'm young and I'm planning to breastfeed a child, or there are a variety of reasons you would want to keep your breast tissue. And so you might say, you know what, for now, I'm just going to do increased screening. So every 6 months, I'll do either a breast MRI or a mammogram, and I'll just be really on top of my screening. I'll practice great breast awareness. And maybe when I'm older and my risk increases, then I will think about going ahead and getting that surgery. But it's really a conversation about what are your goals? What does your doctor suggest? What are your current health concerns to help you make these decisions in terms of preventative medicine?
That's really beautiful. So it's like a very personalized one-on-one treatment plan where there is no right answer. and it's
Yeah.
dependent on the patient's comfort level and what's best for the patient. I really like that you said that you presented it. Here is the percentage. How does that make you feel? Like that is right, because that's not something that
Right.
in the qualitative or the quantitative data you don't see that. It's more of like the qualitative
Right.
side of things. It's like, yeah,
Right.
that's a really important thing to be asking.
Right. And that's why genetic counseling is this beautiful marriage of quantitative and qualitative, because like we need quantitative to know what genes are associated with which conditions, what the risks are. We need data. Like we need to be able to make sure that we are sharing with our patients all of the most accurate, up to date, inclusive, detailed, lifespan, exhaustive data on a certain condition so that they can then make decisions that feel in alignment with their and their family's goals.
It's
Because, for example, some people might say, oh, if I have BRCA1 variants that are associated with increased risk for breast cancer, I'm going to do IVF. I'm going to do genetic testing to make sure I don't pass this down to a child. And other people might say, well, this is my lived experience. I have the gene and my life's not so bad. I'll just wing it and see if my child has it. Neither one is wrong. They're just two approaches. And so we talk about all of that. And that's why having a good care team is great. And that's why I think genetic counselors are often embedded in hospital settings where they work with other doctors closely, because that way you can share all of that expertise and share all of that knowledge.
it's the counseling side of genetic counseling.
Yeah. 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 Like that's why it's called genetic counseling, is because it's counseling. It's how do you feel about it? It's a lot of you don't have to make a decision today. It's a lot of I'll call and follow up, writing patient notes. I loved writing patient notes. That's when you essentially take everything you talked about, because I love getting to say in the beginning of the conversation, you don't have to remember any of this. I
Yeah,
will write all of this down and I will send it to you. And I will send it to you in a way that has been written so that you can understand it. Like I'm not sending you a clinical note that I would send to your doctor. I'm sending a note that I wrote for you, Belinda, based on our conversation and what you've told me you care about,
that's
which is
really
fun.
and like accessible to me.
Exactly. So like if you're like, I have a PhD in yeast biology, I'm going to spend less time explaining what DNA is, but I'm still going to explain it a little bit because we all could use a refresher. Also, did you study yeast? I
No,
forget. What was your organism?
fruit flies and
Where were
ants.
you? Fruit flies and ants, of course, ants. This makes sense.
My model organism ate the yeast.
Fruit flies and ants. Fruit flies, I do think are like kind of the coolest.
A follow-up question to the genetic indicators that we had talked about, which was, spreading the
Yeah.
gambit of yes, this is definitive or this is an indicator. Are there genetic indicators that would point to a certain treatment not being effective? Scutis says, I'm aware of some sort of analysis like this being used to identify effective mental health treatment. I know as well there have been some like
Mm.
screens that you can do where you at home test and then it's like, all right, these are the drugs that can be effective for you versus not. Is that something also that the genetic counselor would be doing, or how does that end up being followed?
Yeah, all of that's really great. So to kind of start, there's sort of two big classes of genetic testing. There's medical genetic testing. So that's genetic testing that is ordered for you by a healthcare provider. So by a genetic counselor, by a doctor, that is medical genetic testing. And that's going to be testing that's done through a CLIA certified lab. That's going to be testing that has been very well documented, very well researched. We know this is a higher accuracy. So very precise, very like well documented, well researched, well studied. And then there's something called direct consumer testing. Direct consumer testing or DTC testing is like ancestry.com, 23andMe. These tests are great for people who are looking for like fun facts. But typically they're not going to be as exhaustive as a medical test. And so we don't recommend making any healthcare decisions based on direct consumer testing. Healthcare decisions meaning what medications you're going to take or what healthcare screenings you're going to pursue. An example I like to give kind of talks about the technology differences and why. Because I think sometimes you might be like, are you just being snobby? Like, are you just being very elitist because direct consumer is really accessible and not everyone can go to the hospital? So, like, are you just being a snob? But it actually is a different kind of test. So, if we think of our genes as words, if we think of our genes as like letters in a sentence, then direct consumer testing is essentially saying, all right, we're going to look for your risk of breast cancer based on this gene BRCA1. And so they're going to say the most common typos in that gene that cause an increased risk for breast cancer are these three typos. So we're going to look for those three typos. And if you have one of those three typos, then we're going to say, oh, you're at an increased risk for breast cancer. And if you don't have one of those three typos, then we're going to say, you're at a general population risk for breast cancer based on this test. Whereas a medical test is going to say, we're not going to just look for the three most common typos. We're going to actually like spell out the entire word and we're going to look for any typo. And we're going to understand exactly what that typo means, what the risk is to you. Is it the highest risk? Is it a moderate risk? Like, what do we know about this change? How could it get passed on to a child? Like, we're really going to explore it in more depth. And so those are sort of the two big differences. And then the testing that you were talking about regarding like mental health and like what medications are going to be most effective for different mental health conditions or other conditions is something called pharmacokinetics. And pharmacokinetics is a subset of genetic testing that can be ordered medically or DTC that essentially explores the way that your body breaks down certain chemicals or certain drugs and can help us predict how you might respond to different medications. Some of it's more accurate than others. So like some of pharmacogenetics testing or pharmacokinetics testing is like very well documented. Like you're going to do this testing before you receive certain treatments to help make sure that this is a safe treatment for you. And others we're going to order, if you're not responding to something, we're like, could it be pharmacokinetics? Let's run that test to confirm. And then others, you might run it and we might be like, well, based on this, we predict this, but it's not really well studied yet. It's not well documented. We don't know exactly how helpful this result is going to be to us in terms of medical decision making. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I'm terrified to say, but Turgis would like to ask you a question. Okay. So, Helen, how are you always so awesome every time you're here?
Is that not true at all. You guys are clearly just a very tolerant and generous group of people. Because I just come up here and ramble. And then afterwards, I'm like, once again, not sure if I said anything, but I used a lot of words saying my nothing. Also, wait, stop. The wombat hole, pharmacokinetics, and it describes what the body does to the drug. That's so real. We talk about pharmacogenetics and pharmacokinetics as what the drug does to the body and what the body does to the drug. It's kind of how you keep them apart. So that's super cool.
Is there a high-risk result on a DCT a good indicator to talk to a doctor and look into the risk further?
What a money question. Yeah. And the good direct-to-consumer testing will say, like, if you have this result, talk to your doctor. So, like, they'll often say, like, if you get this result, you should speak with a genetic counselor. And some of the companies used to employ genetic counselors. I'm not sure if they still do, but some of the companies actually used to employ genetic counselors. And so they'd be like, if you have this result, you should call one of our genetic counselors. And also a big thing is, share your results with your doctor. And if your doctor isn't familiar with genetic testing, you can find a genetic counselor like online for yourself. And you can call and you can make a self-referral. And different hospitals and different healthcare institutions are going to handle those differently. But you can always, contact the genetic counselor and be like, here's why I'm reaching out to you. Can I get on your schedule? Yeah. NSGC, National Society of Genetic Counselors, if you go to the website, there's like a little button that says like, find a genetic counselor, and you can find it in your area. And you can always talk to them about like insurance coverage because we love asking upfront about insurance coverage.
Yeah, no, 100%. Especially in New Jersey, where apparently when you get referred to a hospital location, they don't actually have any idea if you're actually covered. You have to do all the footwork for it.
No, have you ever gotten a bill that came to you instead of through your insurance? Because that is terrifying. And like when I was in grad school, I had Medicaid. I had the one that you have when you're in grad school. And it was terrifying because like when you could get care, most things were covered, but getting care was really, really hard. And so I was lucky to be generally healthy, but I was sort of like, all right, guess I'm just going to not do blood work for a few years and hope that my blood is normal.
So what does Helen do today? So like, how did you transition to like, are you still actively doing genetic counseling or do you transition to, I know you do, as we say here, that you're the head of philanthropy at Fred Hutch.
I love the promotion I get.
But like, how does that transition occur and what drove you to this particular transition?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's funny because in the same way that it's like the head of philanthropy, my family's always like, she's a scientist. I'm always like, not a scientist. Like, I'm always like, no. My grandma's always like, doctor. I'm like, no. But yeah, honestly, like if I was giving the sugar-coated version, I would be like, oh, I was just really passionate about Fred Hutch and I believed in the work they were doing and I knew I had to get involved. And like, none of that's factually inaccurate. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that genetic counseling is sort of going through a bit of a rough time. in terms of employment. We're a pretty small niche field. And one of the challenges is that the way we built insurance can be very challenging. And so we don't always make a lot of money for hospitals. And so we're not always a great financial investment for hospitals. And also, a few big genetic counseling companies that employed genetic counselors laid off all their genetic counselors, went bust, because genetic testing is not necessarily a very financially profitable industry. And so all of these, employers of genetic counselors sort of went bust. And so all these really experienced genetic counselors flooded the already very, very, kind of competitive environment. And then my classmates and I graduated, and we were like, oh shoot, like how are we going to get jobs? Because previously the pattern has been like genetic counselors, such a small field in such high demand, they could go anywhere. And this is sort of one of the first times that the field is like temporarily oversaturated, it feels like. And so I ended up interviewing for a couple different jobs, and I got 2 offers. One of them was as a genetic counselor in the Midwest at a hospital there. And it was a great sounding job. And I was like, it's clinical genetic counseling with patients. And like, I went to grad school and left my job in biotech, left all of my friends and family, moved to the East Coast to hemorrhage money on this degree because I wanted to work with patients so badly. And like, I loved it and like was pretty good at it. And I was like, I want to do this. But it was also the Midwest in, a place where I didn't know anyone. And it's not that I was scared to live by myself in a new place again, because I've done that before. I did that when I was in Louisiana. I did that for grad school. But it was that I wasn't sure I wanted to. And so I also had the job offer in Seattle from Fred Hutch, which was for scientific content liaison, where I would still be using those like communication skills, the science education skills, science writing, science interpretation. And it got me back to the place where my family, my biological family that raised me, and my chosen family that I have picked throughout undergrad and grad school, and like just like life working in Seattle too for a few years before grad school, all of those people and those connections were also here, including my sister, who's like one of the most important people in the entire world. Not just to me, point blank. And so it was an agonized decision. It was a truly agonized decision. And Fred Hutch offered me the job and I accepted it. And the next day I got the formal, like written job offer from the other company. And I do wonder sometimes if I'd gotten them in different orders, if I would be where I am today. But I don't know. I don't think everything happens for a reason, but I think everything happens. That's actually from Dr. Horville's sing-along. But yeah, so that's kind of my story. Is I was looking for any job in genetic counseling, and then I was looking for jobs in Seattle. And I found the Fred Hutch job as one of the in Seattle jobs that would use my degree, but use it creatively and get me closer to like my sister and my people. So that's why I'm here. Yeah. And I love it. I'm very, very lucky. I have the most amazing team. Like I'm so lucky, but it's not what I expected to be doing. And in the same way that like we're all complex and like we can all feel many feelings at once, I feel like every day I really believe in Fred Hutch. Like I think that the doctors and the scientists that I get to meet are so curious and passionate and motivated to create a better healthcare system for all, cures and lower toxicity and better prevention. And so I do believe in Fred Hutch's mission. And every day I wake up excited to find ways to contribute to that mission in any way I can. If it's by fundraising, if it's just by spreading awareness of different kinds of healthcare, if it's just teaching the community to make people feel like science is accessible and safe and not scary or elitist. But also every day I'm a little sad that I don't see patients anymore. And I think all of that's okay. So that's my long ramble.
No, I think that's illustrates the beauty of complexity, that we are not our jobs, right? And our
Yeah.
jobs are not us, that you're taking an entire person into this, right? So the importance of your
Yeah.
family, your sister, your chosen family also influence what you end up doing at the very end. One
Yeah.
thing, Helen, that I think that you're incredible at, and I think a lot of this community would agree with, is how good you're able to communicate science and really, really complex ideas. Can you tell us, like, what do you think was the part of the journey that got you to be such an incredible science communicator?
I think it's chatting with really tolerant people. I think it probably goes back to I think probably just like the fact that I've always loved English. Like when we were first chatting and it was like, did you always want to go into science? It's like, well, I always loved words. I always loved books. And I love just like having that connection. And I think that it feels really good to be understood and to understand another person. I think that's just like such a lovely feeling. And I think that my desire in life is just to make other people happy and like, if not happy, like feel better. And I think that understanding science and understanding our own health can make things feel a lot less scary and can also help us help other people more, right? Because it can help us be more inclusive. It can help us be more understanding. And so I think that just like talking to a lot of people and taking feedback and reading everything and learning from people and making mistakes and owning those mistakes, I don't know. I think it's just a lot of trial and error and finding really gracious people to practice all of that with.
I mean, you are absolutely incredible at it. And the whole community is just like, yeah, she's absolutely the best. She's incredible.
A very nice group.
As we round out, because we have had you on for longer, and I want to be respectful of your time and make sure you can have whatever soup that you're looking forward to tonight for dinner. Um, Question that we've been asking every one of our guests that has been on so far is, it's been a common theme of this month. It's Women's History Month. We're having this feature on incredible women in STEM. What does it mean to you to be a woman in STEM?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. Oh boy, and I'm glad I didn't hear anyone else's answers because that would be very intimidating. I think to me, being a woman in STEM is kind of interesting because on the one hand, I come from a family where my parents both studied engineering and my mom's always been like one of the smartest people I know. And so she was an engineer and then she taught math and then she's an accountant now. She would say bookkeeper because she's like, don't give me a raise, don't give me a promotion. But she works with math. And so like she's just always been really smart. And so on the one hand, I was like, yeah, of course women could be in STEM. But on the other hand, it is, I think, I think to me, being a woman in STEM just means being yourself in STEM and not feeling like I need to be more masculine or like I need to be any more of one identity. I think I spent a lot of time, especially when I was working in biotech, really not being who I was, being like, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to be like more, I'm just going to like, I'm going to get the work done. I'm going to be super focused. And I think to me, being like femme in STEM or woman in STEM is just like being who you are and doing science as who you are. And that's like really refreshing and different and easier than being quiet all the time. God.
So you were
Yeah.
finding that like in the biotech field, it was much more of combative to be yourself, right? That you weren't able to be expressive, and there was this. You even said like deepening voice. And there's like these expectations upon what were the norms versus where
Yeah.
you're at now. Was the transition out of that scary, almost as much as it was going into it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also that you spend so much of your life trying to be one way and trying to be one thing. And then you kind of, when you're like, I'm just going to be who I am, you're kind of like, who am I again? Because like there's so many different versions of us. Like there's like Balint as a husband is not exactly the same as Balint as a father, is not exactly the same as Balint as a friend. But these are all like important identities to you. And so it's finding how we're the same in all of those roles and also accept the differences that we are in those roles. Um, like obviously in genetic counseling settings, I'm not always going to be this like loosey goosey if I'm with a patient who like really wants someone who's like more like direct or more somber. I'm going to match whatever my patient needs from me. And I think that, yeah, I think that it's just about like being who you are and seeing people that you share identities with. So like, I think it's nice to see diversity in the workplace, to see folks who are like you and are not like you, because that way you avoid bias in your research because you're not all homogenous. But you also feel safe because there are similarities. I think it's nice to see other women in the workplace, and it's nice to see people that aren't women in the workplace. It's just kind of it's nice to feel like everyone can be who they are and be safe in who they are. And you being who you are isn't hurting anyone else being who they are, you know?
Absolutely. Helen, thank you so much for your time tonight, for your
Thank you.
expertise, for your insight, for being an incredible ambassador of science to the world. Is there anything that you'd like to round out the discussion with? Any final talking point? Anything that you want to leave us with?
No, y'all are always lovely. The one thing I'll ask before I let you get back to Amber or whatever else you have planned for your evening, or maybe going to bed because I know you're on the East Coast and it is reasonably late there.
I, Helen, I don't know if you know this, but I don't sleep.
I
That's
do
what
know this
the
about you
community's
actually.
running joke is kind of actually sleep.
Jackie and I have talked about this. Jackie's like, how do we think they do it? And I was like, I don't think he or Lita sleep at all. I just don't think because there's simply not enough hours in the day. Yeah. But so my last question for you, I think would be like, what's something that one of the other six guests, who again, we've already decided and established are far more impressive and professional, what's something that they've said that you're like, that was inspiring? Love that. I want to hear it now.
So I've actually been going back and clipping each one of them
Mm-hmm.
on back in the streams and highlighting them because I think each of them is so unique and it kind
Yeah.
of it's hard to encapsulate it in 45 seconds, right? That's I think the difficulty is
Yeah.
because we've had guests who've told us, you know what, it wasn't easy. There were
Yeah.
times
It's not.
I wanted to quit because I was a woman in science and
Yeah.
there was this whole mindset of why are you here? And if someone
Yeah.
else got spoken to like they were,
Yeah.
fine,
Yeah.
and then you're
Begging people
not.
to make eye contact with you is crazy. When you're like, yeah, begging someone to make eye contact with you because you're like, no one's looking at me and you don't feel like you're allowed to talk. Yeah, no, it's crazy. Yeah.
And so, but in spite
Yeah.
of that, the takeaway was something of inspiration. That it
Yeah.
was still, it means a lot to me that was able to go through this, but
Yeah.
also I can hopefully serve as a platform for someone else to want to go through this. Right.
Right.
So, and then a lot of the sentiment that you echoing from what you said too, of being able to see someone else in the workplace who is also a woman in STEM, right? Or
Yeah.
identifies as a woman in STEM, being like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's more of me here and it's okay. And it's just
Yeah.
like showing the importance of being like, it doesn't matter if you're a woman in STEM or not. It just matters like you are STEM. And the
Right.
fact is
Right.
like someone will be looking up to you, Helen. Like my hope is that someone who's watching the stream or listening afterwards will be like, you know what? She is an incredible science communicator and God, I hope I can be like her one day.
No, having people that like you can like connect to and feel approachable. Yeah. When I was in biotech, there were like a few amazing women that I worked with. Yeah. Shout out Becky, shout out Steph, like amazing scientists that I was like, "Oh yeah. Like these, yeah. Like those are my people. I could do that." And those yeah, it's the relationships that kind of get you through.
Absolutely, yeah. And so it's
Yeah.
honestly, I can't pick out a single one of like which one was
Yeah.
most inspirational because they're just I think Hi Jules echoed it the best that I feel like is the sentiment for all of our guests so far. Be like, she was like, you know what? I have the imposter syndrome. A lot of times I
Yeah.
don't feel I could belong, but when I look in the mirror, I'm a quote bad bitch. And at the end of the day, it's like, you know what?
Yeah.
You really are. You have the expertise in it. You are the expert. Flaunt it. Do it. And
Yeah.
and it's one of those where it's like I really don't want us to ever have to say feel like that we have to say that, but we're not at that point
Yeah.
yet, right? We're not at the
Yeah.
point. And so I
Yeah.
love that we have had so many incredible guests on. We're like, you know what? Flaunt it.
Yeah, I love that. That's yeah, I think that's great. Yeah. At one time, I had a fortune cookie and it said, "If you got it, flaunt it." And I went, "Not really a fortune, but that's fun."
It's not at all a
Not a
fortune, but
fortune,
you know
just
what?
like a piece of advice.
It's a nice sentiment, and it's one of
Yes.
those where I feel like I hope that people will go back and look back at the VODs on the YouTube or on the podcast and just listen to these interviews and just see the passion behind each of these incredible women in science and just see
Trying.
each one of y'all are like have gone through very different journeys to get what you are. Each one of you is successful, and each one
Trying.
of y'all is just a badass, and it's just thank you for being an incredible representative and advocate for sciences.
Well, thank you. Science Channel is the best. The colony is the best. Because that's the thing. It's like we're only going to get science to the people if the people engage with the science. And that's what you're doing. So it's amazing.
But truly, thank you, Helen, for your time and expertise. And we look forward to having
Anytime.
you on in the next Fred Hutch crossover stream. That was Helen Anderson. You can find links to the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center's website and other social media links in the show notes. Thanks for listening. See you next time.